So today, talking about the Gospel of Thomas, I decided to do this around Easter time. I was doing some research for talks around Easter, and I just love the Gospel of Thomas. The little bit of the history about it. Before we do that, the Gospel of Thomas was one of about 30 texts that were found at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt by a farmer who was drilling a well in 1945. And they're believed to be from around the 2nd or 3rd century. And it was interesting. The farmer found this sealed clay jar when he dug down for the well and dug it up, opened it up, and found all these old papyrus documents. It's believed they're probably from the library at Alexandria when it was destroyed. Somebody took it out and buried it so it wouldn't be burned. And he took it home, and his wife used some of it to cook dinner, so to stoke the fire. And then he began to hear that they might be valuable, so he started to approach some people at the libraries and things and ended up selling them to some folks who were able to actually study them. So a few of the documents kind of got disappeared, but there was a variety of, they're generally called Gnostic Gospels. And the Gnostics were a group of that were considered to be heretics in the Christian foundation. The Gnostics essentially did not see Jesus as the only Savior. Now, Thomas is not a Gnostic gospel, but Thomas does not speak to the divinity of Jesus either. And what the Gospel of Thomas is simply a list of partial sayings. It appears to be teachings. There's no narrative. There's no birth story, there's no crucifixion story, there's no resurrection, there's no miracles. There's a few parables. And about a half to 2/3 of the Gospel of Thomas sayings also appear in the 4 canonical Gospels in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's unclear which of them were written first. They know of the 4 canonical Gospels that Mark was written first. That was probably written somewhere between 30 and 60 years after Jesus would have left the scene. And that was the earliest gospel. And Luke was written last, probably somewhere between 100 and 125 years after Jesus left the scene. And it's believed Thomas was written somewhere between 20 and 100 years after Jesus left the scene. There's a lot of dispute about that. But it's just a list of sayings. And most of the sayings that were put into the canonical Gospels were changed quite a bit in terms of the essential meaning. So it's considered one of 2 source documents that were probably used for the early Gospels. The other document is called the Q document, that comes from a Aramaic word that was used for it, and that document has never been found. But it's believed to exist. It was written about, but it's a copy of it has never been found. So Andrew Harvey, who I should, full disclosure, has been excommunicated by the Catholic Church, however, is a biblical scholar and has studied the Gospel of Thomas extensively. But I should point out that he was excommunicated by Benedict, in fact, when he was working in that office in Germany. The Gospel of Thomas really is, I believe, the clearest guide we have to the vision of the world's supreme mystical revolutionary, the teacher known as Jesus. And what Andrew and others believe is that the Gospel of Thomas reveals evidence of Jesus as a very radical person of his day, that he was preaching against many of the governmental authorities and many of the religious authorities of his time, and that much of that essence was changed over the 300 or so years between the writing of Matthew and the installation and establishment of what finally became the version of the New Testament that was accepted in the 4th century at the Council of Nicaea. There were a lot of politics went on. If you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a wonderful book called Beyond Belief by Elaine Pagels, who is a very well-known, probably one of the leading biblical scholars in the United States, that talks about the process of creating the New Testament as it exists. Anyway, so this is what was found, some of the things are obviously not in the best shape. They've been underground for hundreds of years. Clay is not the best thing to keep out moisture and oxygen and things like that. But what was found was largely able to be read and translated, and there were any number of versions of this. And the existing, these were copies of originals. None of these were believed to be the original documents. So back before they didn't even have mimeograph machines back then. They just would copy everything down. So these versions were copies of originals that could have themselves been changed. So it's not really clearly understood exactly what the original documents in any of these cases would have said exactly. So Andrew says, what Jesus woke up to and proceeded to enact with the fiercest imaginable intensity was this new life of the kingdom consciousness, not as a savior. The Gospel of Thomas makes this very clear. He refers to himself as the Son of Man in the Gospel of Thomas, and that term is also used in at least 2 of the Canonical Gospels. But he's also preaching a very radical view of life. And we're going to look at a few of the sayings from the Gospel of Thomas today to kind of give you a flavor of that. But this quote goes on. He says, "But as a sign of what is possible for all human beings who dare to awaken to the potential splendor of the inner truth and the responsibilities for total transformation of the world, it then inspires within them." What Jesus was saying, and you can certainly get a flavor of this in the Canonical Gospels as well, is that we should be about realizing our own sense of accountability and responsibility for our own lives, that we have within us an amazing power, but that most turn away from it, and most seek to find and to obey external authority. And you can imagine back in those days, as it is today in many cases, everything was based in external authority. The priestly class, that there were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some other folks that were kind of the priestly class that ruled with a pretty much of an iron fist over the Jews of the day in that part of the world. You were not supposed to question anything. And of course they were under Roman rule, which was itself rather autocratic, as you can imagine. You've seen the movies, right? You've seen Spartacus, right? So the idea of a human being as a free agent, as having within them their own authority, was a radical idea. Still kind of is. It's more familiar today, but it certainly isn't a dominant consciousness on the planet today. So what Andrew Harvey is a really interesting guy. I'd love to get him here sometime. He's one of the most fiery speakers you'll ever see. And aside from his views of the Gospels, he was also a gay biblical scholar, and that didn't go over so well in the church, back in the 80s and 90s. But he's really quite an interesting guy, and his books are very powerful. He's very much today into what he calls radical spiritual activism. And you can find him on Facebook and on the web, and he's doing some really interesting things. That's kind of an aside. So let's look at a couple of key sayings from this Gospel of Thomas. And one of the things you'll find is, of the early writings, there tend to be a couple of major influences in terms of the geography of the Middle East, which was known as the Levant in those days. And the key influences tended to be those that were kind of centered from Egypt up into what is now Palestine, and perhaps just in the southern edge of Persia, which is now Iraq, and the Oriental influence that kind of came from the northern end of the Middle East that carried over into what is now Afghanistan and so forth. And there were very different styles. The Babylonians kind of had a style, and this gospel has a lot of Oriental seeming influence, that Eastern kind of an influence, which is, by the way, where the wise men were supposed to have come from. Right, so it was not unusual. In fact, in the Old Testament, you can see these two influences unfolding within the various books of the Old Testament. So this is the second saying. There are 114 sayings that are in the book, and they don't appear to be in any particular order. Jesus said, "The seeker should not stop until he finds. When he does find, he will be disturbed. After having been disturbed, he will be astonished. Then he will reign over everything. You say that's very Zen-like, right? Kind of, it's not exactly what I'm used to hearing, So let me share a little bit about what Andrew Harvey says about this. He says, this saying suggests that Jesus is speaking in the Gospel of Thomas, the Jesus that is speaking, is not presenting himself as a Messiah with a unique realization and a unique status of mediator. This Jesus, for me, the authentic Jesus, is like the Buddha, a human being who was awakened to the full glory of his inner divinity, and so knows the secret of every human being and hungers to reveal it to change the world. The life to which this Jesus is inviting everyone is not one of endless seeking, but one of finding. Finding the truth and power of human divinity by risking everything to uncover them. From his own harrowing experience, Jesus knows that finding cannot be without suffering. To find out the truth and power of your inner divinity is to be disturbed. Disturbed by the gap between your human shadow and its dark games and the abyss of light within. By the price that any authentic transformation cannot help but demand, by the grandeur you are beginning to glimpse of your real royal nature with all its burden of responsibility and solitude. Jesus knows too, however, that if you risk the disturbance and surrender to the unfolding of your divine nature, extraordinary visions will be awoken within you. Visions that will astound you and drag you into what the Sufi mystics call the Kingdom of Bewilderment. That placeless place where everything you have imagined to be true about yourself or about humanity is reduced to rubble by the splendor of what you discover. Now, this is not unlike a lot of the mystical teachings of all over the world, where individuals become awakened, and that does seem to be a fairly individual path to awakening to enlightenment. And then there is this really interesting sense of urgency that arises. I think we saw it within Ernest Holmes, who I think had his strongest mystical experiences near the end of his life. And in the last decade of his teaching became, a little impatient in trying to get the word out, if you will. And the example of that in the Canonical Gospels, in the narrative portion, is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who must have some kind of idea that the next day is going to be a rough day. He's going to be arrested and taken into custody and tried. So he goes to, now remember, you have to understand the metaphor in the Bible, the way it's used. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane on a mountain. Whenever they go onto a mountain in the Bible, they're going to a higher place in consciousness. And he takes with him Peter, James, and John of the disciples. And each of the disciples represents a quality of the inner person. So he takes integrity, love, and power, which is what the three of them represent. And Jesus goes off to meditate and asks them to hold the high watch and be in prayer for him. And he comes back and they're asleep. You ever had your inner faculties go to sleep on you when you needed them? Well, that's what's being described here. And he says, wake up! Don't you see the importance of this moment? And imagine him saying this to himself as he's in meditation, going into fear, trying to figure a way out. Right? What would you be doing? Can I make it to Mexico? He's probably thinking, can I make it to Assyria, tomorrow? Will that donkey get me there? And then he says, no, I have to bring myself back into alignment. And he comes, and they wake up, and he's back into his good space, and he goes back into meditation and comes back, and they're asleep again. And then you hear footsteps coming up the path, and it's a few centurions with that other disciple that was sold him for 30 pieces of silver. And off he goes. See? So that when you look at that story in the context of statements like this from the Gospel of Thomas, what you recognize is that Jesus was seen as incredibly dangerous. Not just a nuisance. to the authorities of the day, but incredibly dangerous, because there's nothing that the unawakened authority fears more than an awakened individual. In the Middle Ages, they used to have a saying in the church in Europe: "Woe be to the bishop who has a saint in his parish." Because someone who is a true saint is going to drive you nuts, pointing out all the ways you're being inconsistent with the ultimate teaching, all the ways you're gathering wealth for the diocese rather than serving the poor, for example. But see, this isn't just about the authorities, it's about ourselves. How do we respond when our better self tries to wake us up and remind us that we're not on the true path? Don't we kind of say, "Shut up, leave me alone"? We do that how? We do that by rationalizing what we're doing. Well, I have to do this, because if I don't, I'll lose this. The seeker should not stop until he finds. See, the essence of this statement is that most people don't get to the finding. Ties in with one of the Beatitudes: the poor shall always be with us. He meant the poor in spirit. When you do find, you will be disturbed. There's nothing more disturbing than finding out you're magnificent beyond measure. It scares the hell out of us. It scares the hell out of us. Me? I'm magnificent beyond measure, but I have this whole resume of mediocrity behind me that I've been riding into the future. And I've been giving myself the benefit of the doubt and letting myself off and making excuses and rationalizing why I'm not being more fully present to myself in the world. And now you tell me I really am an enlightened being? That's disturbing. It's scary, because you know what? You know that every relationship in your life has just changed. Because when you have a transformative experience of yourself, you alter every relationship you're in. And I don't know about you, but my experience has been, as I've seen people wake up around me, that I even find it annoying. Because I have to change my relationship with them, and they have to change their relationship with me. And I didn't ask to do that. Your family didn't ask you to wake up. They've been counting on you staying predictable. It's comfortable, even if they don't like you. Isn't that funny how we are? And they'll subtly try to put you back where you belong, where they think you belong. You know, don't go getting a swelled head now. Don't put yourself out there. I don't want to see you fail, so I want you to stay right here where it's safe. See? After having been disturbed, you will be astonished. Oh my God. And then you will reign over everything. So the way to tell if you're there or not is if you're reigning over everything. If you're not, you're somewhere between the seeker and being astonished. And you get to figure out what that is for yourself. The next saying 3, which again, they're not in any order, apparently. Jesus said, if your leaders say to you, look, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds will be there before you are. If they say that the kingdom is in the sea, then the fish will be there before you are. Rather, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. When you understand yourselves, you will be understood. If you do not know yourselves, then you exist in poverty, and you are that poverty. Now, a couple of interesting things about this statement. The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. In the canonical Bibles, that outside of you part didn't get there, and yet that became the basis for mainstream Christian teaching. That the flesh is weak, that we need to be in the ascendant understanding of spirit is good, everything that's matter is sinful and evil, that we should be ashamed of our physicality, ashamed of our bodies, ashamed of our sexuality. And he's saying, no, it's all sacred. It's all sacred. The way I interpret this is, if you hear anything that doesn't run true to what is in your heart, listen to your heart. That's a tough assignment, you know, because most of us have been through years of education where we got no credit for what was in our heart. And yet, that's where our gyroscope is. That element that keeps us on track, that can call us back to who we really are. If you do not know yourselves, then you exist in poverty, and you are that poverty. Sounds a lot like the idea that the only way to access your divinity is within yourself, and to know yourself more and more fully, and by doing that you know the divine more and more fully. Now, one has to ask, did this teaching ever catch on? It wasn't very popular 2,000 years ago, we know that. The teacher was killed. Setting the stage for a bigger event, I realize. But you know what? I would wager it still hasn't caught on. If you wonder about this idea of knowing yourself and the value of knowing your own divinity and recognizing that and being your own authority, then why are there more prescriptions than people in the United States today? I was talking to someone in the healthcare profession, in the mental health profession in Dallas, and what she was telling me was that when she did a study of psychiatric practices in the area, the average patient was on 9 medications. Average. 9 medications. How the hell can you find yourself when you're on drugs all the time? Not to say that the drugs don't have benefits in some cases. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when you look at the grand scope of what's going on, the massive outbreak of depression in our culture. If you do not know yourself, then you exist in poverty, and you are that poverty. Somebody saying that today would probably be in a little trouble, don't you think? The kingdom is within you and is outside of you, and when you understand yourself, you will understand it. You are the road, the pathway to the truth, and yet what do we do to ourselves to keep ourselves from being present, because we've become convinced that to be present is to be in misery or to suffer? Brings me to a quote I've used here before by my dear friend Dr. Charles Geddes, who's down in Fort Lauderdale. He said, "You arrived on this planet without an instruction manual, and you were misinformed. You were told in so many ways that you're separate from that which created you. You were told in so many ways that you're inadequate. Interesting, I was looking at a blog, a photo blog on Tumblr about advertising for women, looking back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the way body image and things like that were sold. Now, today we're much more sophisticated. We're actually better at it. It's not unusual for 7- and 8-year-old girls to be on diets today, because they look at the advertisements. But the other thing we're beginning to see now is what's being done artificially to make people look good, look impossible, right? But that's just making a small dent in the issue. If my value is tied to my physical appearance, I'm pretty much either set for life or screwed when I show up. Not much I can do about it. A little bit, but not much. And even the idea that that is so strips me of the likelihood that I will go within and find the splendor within, because if I feel like I'm beautiful and I'm treated like I'm beautiful, I stay at the surface. That's where all the rewards are. And if I feel like I'm unattracted and it's communicated to me that I'm not attractive and not worthy and, all the other stuff that goes with that, and I buy into that being true, then I tend to stay at the surface and suffer, maybe go within to feel my pain. But rarely to go in and find that splendor within. That's such an exception. Try to find a movie or a TV show that's uplifting today. They know people won't go. We don't want to watch something that reminds us of what we could be but we're not being. Let me see something get blown up, for God's sake. Because otherwise, I might have to go within and find something that's really wonderful and amazing, and then what would that do to my life? Upset the tea cart, right? Andrew Harvey says, the radicalism of this saying should not be underestimated. Jesus is consciously and with the most subversive imaginable scorn mocking all versions of the spiritual journey that place the ultimate experience beyond this world in some transcendent otherwhere. That everything you're doing today is to prepare for the next life. That's not what he's saying. It's here, it's now. If you have ears to hear and eyes to see, open your eyes and open your ears. That's what he says. If you don't, you are that poverty. All the patriarchal religions and mystical transmission systems, including those conceived in Jesus' honor, subtly devalue the immanent, the internal, in favor of the transcendent, keeping intact the status quo in all its misery, horror, and injustice. How can you have a holy war if the divine is within each being? Can't do it. There was an edict issued by one of the main archbishops. Actually, there were several, but this one was in Spain, so that the Spanish conquistadors going into Central and South America could kill the natives. And the edict was that the indigenous peoples in America had no souls. Therefore, it was okay to kill them. And there was a writing by a Spanish soldier who was in what is now Brazil, and they were claiming land, and he went through, and there were tribal folks in there, and he writes his description of this tribal man that he encountered. And he says, I had my musket and I leveled it at him, and he was no more than 7 feet from me. And I looked into his eyes, and he looked almost human. But I knew that must be a false idea in my mind because of what the archbishop had said. And yet, when I shot him, he seemed to experience pain. It was hard for me to believe. So if those who lead you say the kingdom is in the sky, the birds will get there before you. And if they say the kingdom is in the sea, the fish will get there before you. Where is it? Who am I? What am I? What's going on here? When you really delve into what Jesus taught, it's not a comfortable teaching at all. He's not that beatific European-looking guy with tab hunter's features and a beard that's been pictured so often. He was a probably pretty hard-scrabbled dude in the Middle East, maybe about 5'3" or 5'4" with a dark complexion. He would have had lots of scars because people in those days got beat up a lot. It was a tough world. And he was speaking out against authority, external authority in all of its forms. Dangerous thing to do. And we think we can do it today, and we can to a degree. The price of it today, and I'm sure the price then was to largely be ignored. When you say something that disturbs people, they just kind of go somewhere else. Right? And yet what he was trying to do in this context was to awaken all of us to the magnificence that we are, a magnificence that we have to go through quite an experience to discover for some reason. And you can get back to the question was, why is that so? I don't know. Just seems to be. It seems like no matter how well someone's birth situation is, how good it is, how well you were parented, if you had all the advantages, you still grow up a little screwed up, don't you? Self-questioning, self-doubting. It seems to be part of our DNA. That this awakening does not come easily. You don't just, fall out of bed one day and say, I'm divine. There's some suffering involved in that. Suffering in the sense of going through some difficult concepts, if nothing else, some difficult emotions to get to that incredible jewel that's at the center of our being. And then once we get there and we find that magnificence, we step into that radiance, and then we turn around and look at the outer world again and say, oh, everybody didn't do this? Matter of fact, hardly anybody did this, and they're not really happy that I did this? It's quite interesting. And then your faculties will tend to desert you when you most need them. Your courage goes to sleep. Your compassion disappears briefly, and you become angry. And how many spiritual leaders that have been truly, I think, awakened beings have become so frustrated with trying to get the word out that they, sort of lose it. If you read the Holmes Papers, Volume 3, Ideas of Power, they're sermons from his last decade, and some of those things, he's just really letting people have it. It's like he's saying, wake the hell up. How much, what do I have to do? He was just trying to get him to the disturbed stage. It's Sunday. I don't want to be disturbed. I'm going to brunch. So what our teaching talked about, and what Dr. Holmes got, was the suffering isn't about creating a life that doesn't work. The suffering is about going within and doing the work of realizing what is already so. You don't create the radiance within you. It's already there. But it's probably buried under some stuff that isn't very pretty. Because we were misinformed. We were told something that isn't true. Many, many things. Around here we have a little thing where you say, oh, I'm sorry. I say, no, you're not. You're magnificent beyond measure. Oh, I'm sorry. I said I'm sorry. No, you're not. You're magnificent beyond measure. Now you can apologize if you want. But see, just a little thing like, I'm sorry. Saying I'm sorry is affirming something that isn't true. You're not sorry. You're amazing. What if we just did this? And this comes from Stuart Wilde. He said, what if when you screw up, you don't say I'm sorry, you don't say I apologize, you say, here's what I did, love me. And the correct social response would be, I do love you. Why does that seem so odd? Because when you do something wrong, you should be punished. See, that's part of that misinformed thing. That there's a God that in any way wants you to be punished for anything. That's part of that being misinformed. Jesus said that. Jesus talked about an opulent, forgiving, loving God that knew no bounds. He didn't talk about sin. He didn't care about it. To focus on sin is to miss the mark, and to sin on sin, because that's what sin means, to miss the mark. When you miss the mark, you reaffirm your own greatness, your own divinity, your own possibility, and then you make amends as you need to make them to see how it can be made right, if it can. When he talked about that, Stuart Wilde said he taught his kids that, and his kids would get in all kind of trouble at school because they wouldn't apologize for anything. The teachers would call, your son won't apologize. It's good. Did he say, love me? He said, yeah. Well, that's what he's been trained to do. So he had to retrain him to say, sometimes you're going to have to apologize because the world around you won't accept the idea that you can do something that other people get upset about and then say, love me, and they have to say, I love you back, because they think that's a breakdown of a value system. Okay, now again, we're looking at other people. Let's bring it back. Do I do that to myself and others? Do I insist on reparations when I've been wronged? Do I feel there's something wrong if you do something I label as wrong and then you don't seem to suffer enough for it? Is that part of my shtick? Part of my way of being? And if it is, does it serve me in the world? Who am I to sit in judgment of you? Who am I to sit in judgment of me? Yet how have we been trained? How many times when I was a kid did I hear, for shame, out of somebody's mouth in the house? You should be ashamed of yourself. Sit on the sofa and think about how ashamed you should be. And you do. That's the thing. You sit there feeling awful, programming yourself to accept that as the norm. And we all do it. We all went through that to one degree or another. And the interesting thing is, once we get out of that environment, we become the authorities in our own lives, and we carry the same patterns forward because now they're programmed. And we do it to our kids. Don't say you're sorry. You're magnificent beyond measure. Turn off the phone. See how easy it is? See how uncomfortable it feels? Well, wait a minute. Shouldn't she somehow be made to feel less than so that doesn't happen again? You know, that doesn't work. The guiltier you feel about something, the more likely you are to do it again. You ever notice that? What if you lived in a guilt-free zone? Well, the concern is we've been conditioned to believe, well, if there's no guilt, there'd be no controls. People would just go crazy. Or would we? You're really magnificent today. Okay. So the Gospel of Thomas talks about these ideas in not in every saying, but there's 6 or 7 that we're going to talk about today. The rest will be next week, about some of these things that are so interesting and critical, and how we look at this person who I would refer to as the master teacher, Jesus, teaching us by example, and difficult lessons. Not easy. The easy lessons are no big deal. The difficult lessons are the ones we need to hear, we need to embody, we need to move through, so that we can really transcend our limitations. And when you combine the teachings of Jesus with the science of mind, which shows you how to use your mind in a positive, powerful way, not to say you never look at a negative thing, but to say you know how to deal with the negative thing, and the negative thing isn't real, it's simply an idea, and you can bring a greater idea to bear on it, then you can live in a guilt-free zone. You can live in a suffering-free zone if you choose to, by being willing to look at whatever is true, and only that. And that will be a difficult transition initially for many of us. But like anything else, once you get through that period of transition, it just becomes who you are. It becomes who you are, to be willing to look at anything and know that no matter what, that radiance within you is all that matters. And when you see it in yourself, you'll see it in others. That's the way it works. Thank you, and namaste.